This is obviously the third in a series where we've talked about women's oppression and sexual politics. And the question of sort of Marxism and patriarchy theory is one which I think is absolutely fundamentally important for all sorts of reasons. And the development of patriarchy theory happened as a result of the women's liberation movement, or sometimes called second wave feminism, which definitely doesn't have quite the same ring to it, but that's what it's usually called these days. And the development as a result of that, of, you know, the basic question people, you know, your first response to women's liberation is it's absolutely necessary. Of course, your second response is, well, where does women's oppression come from? You know, in other words, how do you know, you need to know where women's oppression comes from in order to understand how to overcome it and in order to deal with it. So the question of patriarchy theory therefore becomes a very central question. It was a dominant theory in the 1970s and early 1980s, certainly among socialist feminists and among Marxist feminists. And I suppose it arose, I mean, the reason I think it became a question that was so important to people is really twofold. That you had, on the one hand, that the acknowledgement, and it's no secret and no particular surprise, but women's oppression didn't develop with capitalist society. It's a mistake that sometimes people make, because it developed with what Marx and Engels talked about as class society. In other words, much earlier development, and therefore women's oppression existed in all sorts of different societies long before capitalism came on the scene. So the first question is, you know, if it long predates capitalism, is it something that's kind of continued over into capitalism, or is it something that capitalism fundamentally changes? And if it's continued over, which is an argument of a lot of patriarchy theory, then do you need a separate struggle against patriarchy as well as against capitalism? So that's one of the questions, I think, that sort of formed people's ideas about it. The second question was that when Friedrich Engels wrote about the origin of the family, private property and the state, as Elaine talked about a couple of weeks ago, there's a very famous passage in it when he talks about there are two elements that we're dealing with when we talk about society. We're talking about the production and reproduction of everyday life, and what he meant, and he explains what he means by this. He says, you know, when we talk about the production of everyday life, we mean subsistence, how people work, how they get their food, how they live. But we also have the second thing, which is the reproduction of everyday life, which is, if you like, procreation, not just simply physical procreation, but the development of human beings, the reproduction of what we now call labor power, but the reproduction of society, of human beings and of generations of human beings. And I think that the way in which he phrases it in The Origin of the Family has caused quite a considerable different set of analyses about what he really meant from it. And of course, it kind of also opens the door, as was a view that a number of people developed in the late 1970s, that if you've got, on the one hand, production and on the other hand, reproduction, then perhaps you also are talking about two different systems, and that you need two different approaches to how you destroy them. So patriarchy theory was developed, I think, on the left. I mean, there's all sorts of different patriarchy theories, and obviously I'm not going to talk about most of them, but on the left was developed in, I think, in a response to both of those, or to one or the other of those kind of questions. And for women's liberation movement, it became, as I say, a very important theory. Now, patriarchy itself, the word patriarchy, as I'm sure people are aware, it means simply rule of the father. And Marx himself refers to it when he refers to what was called the domestic household system. In other words, where the family existed within a domestic household, and not just existed in a way that we might talk about it today, but where the family and the household was productive. It produced goods. It produced, whether it was various foodstuffs, whether it was textiles, weaving and spinning for a long time in this country and many other countries were initially developed to a considerable extent as domestic forms of production. I mean, you can still, if you go to various parts of the country, like parts of Lancashire and Yorkshire, you can still see the old houses with the lights high up where the weaving and spinning took place. So these were initially domestic household systems, and to Marx and to many other people looking at these, it was clear the head of the family was the man, was the father, and sometimes the grandfather was the older man in the family, and everybody else within the family is subordinate to him. They're reliant on him for their income, for their subsistence, for everything else. And it's obviously, you don't need to be, don't need to be a genius to work out that's probably not a very enlightened and egalitarian system. It's a very oppressive system, which was in all sorts of ways oppressive, not just to women, but to younger men, to children, and so on and so forth. But of course, what happens with capitalism is the domestic household production is essentially no more. It cannot compete. Weaving and spinning in the home can no longer compete with what takes place in the mill and the factory. Production is taken outside of the home into special places where work is carried out. But what happens with the whole kind of theory of patriarchy at this point is that for lots of feminists, they sometimes refer to patriarchy theory or patriarchy and capitalism as dual systems theory. In other words, that there's these two systems going on, and they see the need therefore for separate structures. And even though you've got the destruction of the old previous forms of society, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but even then they still see this patriarchy as something that continues within capitalist society, even though so many fundamental changes have gone on. And so patriarchy is seen both as an ideological system. It's a system of oppressive ideas that which you get in religion, you get in all sorts of parts of the state, where the idea that the woman is subordinate to the man, that any kind of what we call sexual deviation, it doesn't fit in with the norm of heterosexual society, is to be frowned on and sometimes made illegal, or people suffer very, very much as a result of it. There's that ideological aspect to it, but also, of course, for many feminists, they kind of looked at this and thought, well, how can we have a patriarchal system which is just about ideas when you've got the development of capitalist society? Surely the ideas that are going to be created as a result of the development of capitalism will be very different from the ideas simply of male dominance and female subordination. So you then get attempts at various sort of materialist analyses of patriarchy, that there's a kind of real material gain for certain people within capitalist society in order to reinforce and in order to maintain patriarchy, even though it might seem like it comes from a previous era. And so there's different theories. I don't have time to go into them at any length. There's a woman called Heidi Hartman who wrote a very famous series of articles called The Unhappy Marriage of Marxism and Feminism, which were about the idea that Marxism can't explain women's oppression without looking, as she saw it, at the material gains that working class men had as a result of an alliance that they went into with the capitalist class. And she points to the 19th century, the development of legislation which prevented women from working down coal mines, prevented women from working nights, prevented women from working in some industries altogether, most obviously mining, but in some other industries as well. She sees a combination of that, the development of what was called a family wage, where for sections of the working class, they received a wage which was supposedly was big enough to cover the cost, not just of their reproduction, but of the reproduction of their wife and their children as well. And this is something that she sees as a deliberate alliance in order to gain working class men an advantage, and at the same time to push women into the home and to ensure that women were in an inferior domestic situation. There's another woman called Sylvia Walby who talks about patriarchy being what she terms as private patriarchy in the 19th century, by which she means patriarchy within the home, you know, that the man is the head of the household and tells the woman what to do, and it was still common even in the 20th century that women in working class families in some areas and in some industries didn't even know what their husbands earned and were just given a portion of the wage for their subsistence. She talks about that, but then she says that in the 20th century you move from private patriarchy, which is centered in the household, to what she calls public patriarchy, by which she means the role of the state and of the employers in terms of reinforcing women's oppression and women's subordination in that kind of way. There's another woman called Lucy Bland who wrote how capitalism colonized patriarchal relations. In other words, kind of adopted patriarchal relations for its own benefit. Now, I think there's a number of problems with this whole approach to it, and I want to just sort of spell out a few of what I think those problems are. Firstly, I think they demonstrate a real misunderstanding of what capitalism does to society. And if you look at what Marx says about capitalist society and development of capitalism, he sees it as a totality. He sees it, and you can see this in the Communist Manifesto, but you can see it right the way through his work, that he sees it as something which kind of destroys everything that's in its path. It gets rid of the old ideology, it gets rid of the old forms of the family, it gets rid of the old religions, it gets rid of a whole number of things which to the mind of the capitalist in some way hinder the ability to make profits and to produce wealth and to exploit workers. And therefore, one of the things that happened as capitalism developed, and particularly in the textile industry, where it's very, very dramatic, that as the Industrial Revolution happened, what took place then was actually the destruction of the old domestic production family, and the destruction of many, many livelihoods, and the need for every member of the family to develop a relationship with the labor market. In other words, to have to go out to work for a wage, in not always in a factory or a mill, but very, very commonly in factories or mills. And actually, if you look at the history of the Industrial Revolution, it's a history of women and children, particularly young women and children. And capitalism loves young workers for reasons that are absolutely, or should be absolutely obvious to all of us. And they don't like the older ones because they're less productive and less able to do all the things that they think they could do. And in the Industrial Revolution, the men who had worked as weavers and spinners, particularly weavers, which is what much more was a male job before the development of capitalism. By the time you get the development of industrial capitalism, you then get the weaving becomes a woman's job. It's done on these huge looms. You'll have seen pictures of it if you've seen any pictures of the Industrial Revolution, these absolutely gigantic looms that fill the mills. That's carried out by young women and children. And it's the men who are displaced, or few of them are employed as spinners and overseers and all this kind of thing. But it's the older men who are displaced in this thing and who are left very often unemployed. So you have this complete smashing up of the family. I mean, I was reading Barbara Ehrenreich, who died recently, who was very interesting thinker and writer, socialist feminist, American. And she writes about how capitalism actually pulls the rug from under the patriarchal family. It just smashes it up, and it can't cope. Every member of the family is thrown onto the labor market, and they prefer women as workers. So that's the situation in the early 19th century. Hartman argues that actually that changes, and there's some truth in this. It does change by the middle of the 19th century, but not as a conspiracy between male workers and the capitalist class, I would argue, but actually the needs of the working class family, it's such a brutal system, and the conditions, if people have read, again, all sorts of things, for example, Engels on the condition of the working class, will know what a brutal system it is, with massive infant mortality, with terrible conditions, with people working hugely long hours and having to walk to and from the mills at the beginning and the end of their working day, that there was a move from the 1830s, 1840s onwards to kind of stabilize working class life and to improve working class life. And this was something that the working class as a whole welcomed. They welcomed the idea that you didn't have to work so many long hours in the mill, that you didn't have to do all these things. Now, the truth is that also, and again, this is beyond the scope of this talk, but it also led to a degree of sort of conservative institutions in British working class and in bourgeois society in the second half of the 19th century. But nonetheless, it was definitely a step backwards for women, that they were expected to be in the home much more so than they would be at work. But where, of course, in the home they worked as long as they would have worked outside of the home, but not for wages, was the deal that came up. But nonetheless, it wasn't something which was a conspiracy by male workers, and they didn't particularly benefit from it. So that's one question. The second question, which I think the patriarchy really misses out pretty well completely, is the question of class. And, again, there's talk, if you look at Hartman, she'll talk about male workers and the capitalist class, as if there's no females inside the capitalist class. Now, interestingly, the capitalist class isn't a gendered class. It has men and women in it. That's how it reproduces itself, or one of the ways that it reproduces itself. Interestingly, a comment by Hilary Wainwright back in the early 70s shows that even, we're talking 50 years ago, 40% of all private wealth was in the hands of women. I mean, this shouldn't be a surprise to us when we think about, the Queen probably had a fair proportion of that, but there was most capitalist class women will have property, will have wealth, will have all those kind of things. And I think that this whole idea that you can miss out class and that you can see you just see the capitalist class as somehow a sort of male chauvinist class which doesn't like women. I mean, it's true that ruling class women are oppressed, the same as women of all classes are oppressed, but it's a very, very different form of oppression. Engels saw it very much as that they were treated incredibly badly, he thought, by the men of the ruling class, and Marx himself wrote very interestingly on this topic and used examples of how badly women were treated, ruling class women were treated. But nonetheless, they shared in the profits and the benefits of being part of the capitalist class. And in every major class conflict, the women of the ruling class, with one or two individual exceptions, have always sided with the male section of the ruling class. So I think that's an important point to make. And I think it's important when you talk about women today, when we look at women's lives today, it's an interesting phenomenon that if you think about who does work in the home, actually women and men of the working class both do work in the home. I don't want to say it's equal, because it isn't equal, it's different tasks, but there is more work done by men now in the home and less done by women than there was 50 years ago. And that's an effect of women working outside of the home. I mean, basically, when both members of when all members of the family work outside of the home, then it tends to be that less housework is done within the home. Surprise, surprise. But of course, working class women and men do their own housework and their own repairs and all the different sorts of things that you do around the household. But of course, every other class will pay for these domestic services to be carried out, very often by women from ethnic minorities who've migrated thousands of miles, very often leaving their children with their relatives in their home country in order to come and work here, doing some of the most sort of menial jobs. So I think when we look today, I think the whole patriarchy theory really doesn't make a great deal of sense when we're talking about women's oppression today. I think you have to see women's oppression much more as rooted in the system of the family, which is still absolutely central. I mean, it's very interesting that whereas there's lots of tendencies of capital to break down the family, you know, through migration, through making people work incredibly long hours, through people who do work having fewer and fewer children, which is generally a pattern when you look at things. At the same time, it also acts to reinforce the family structure. Today, we have a situation in this country where, whereas it used to be frowned upon for people to have same-sex relationships, now you can have marriage between people of the same sex, quite rightly. But of course, this is a very convenient means of maintaining and continuing the family form rather than looking to challenge the family form. And the family is still the center of the reproduction of labor power. And I would argue that women's oppression is rooted in the fact that women are still at the center of that process of the reproduction of labor power, and that they're the people who have the overwhelming care, whether it's paid or unpaid, to teach, to care for, to nurse the new generation of workers, to socialize them, to do all those kind of different things, usually for wages which are no better than 3/4 of the equivalent that men get. So if you're looking at the roots of women's oppression, I think you have to put it into that family system, which is still very much with us. And of course, that reflects not just wages and conditions and the work that people do, but of course it has a huge impact on domestic violence, on sexual abuse, on a whole range of questions, which again, you know, themselves are topics in themselves of a whole talk. So it seems to me patriarchy doesn't explain any of this stuff, and it's seen as a kind of enduring ideology which continues. But actually, I think we have to look at the roots of women's oppression as in the need, as satisfying the needs of capital, and also that you can only talk about beginning to end women's oppression when you've ended these structures which are so oppressive to women and so oppressive to children and to men as well. You know, the family system is a narrow and in many ways conservative system, which we'd all benefit from at least being able to look at in a much freer and open way, rather than just seeing everybody in a nuclear family living in their own household with their own domestic appliances.